Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, author of the book The Price of Inequality, How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future, and a professor at Columbia University, and Ed Conard, author of Unintended Consequences, Why Everything in Joe Stiglitz's book is Wrong. Not really. Why everything you've been told about the economy is wrong, and a former partner at Bain Capital. But it basically is that, actually. So one of the things, let's start with this question about distribution in the recovery, because I think it's a really interesting one. One of the things about the recovery is, if you look at it in the aggregate, and particularly if you look at it in the aggregate and compare it to other places digging out of financial crisis, it looks pretty good in certain ways. We've rebounded faster than some other economies have coming out of financial crises. If you zoom in and you look at it distributionally, in terms of how does your median worker look, it looks not that good, right? One of the ways of looking at this is just corporate profits and employee compensation in the recovery. Corporate profits hit a new high of 10% of GDP in 2012. Employee compensation fell to a low of 43.5%. So that top line is profits, that bottom line is compensation, and you see in the recovery them moving in opposite directions. Joe, you wrote an op-ed that got a lot of attention, basically making the case that inequality, the levels of inequality, this distributional issue we have, is actually an impediment to macro aggregate growth. With inequality at its highest level since before the Depression, you wrote in the New York Times, a robust recovery will be difficult in the short term, and the American dream, a good life in exchange for hard work, is slowly dying. Politicians typically talk about rising equality and the sluggish recovery as separate phenomena when they are in fact intertwined. Inequality stifles, restrains, and holds back our growth. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, the most obvious reason is that what sustains, particularly the American economy, is consumption.
Yeah.
And the people at the top spend on consumption a smaller fraction than those at the bottom. In fact, those at the bottom have to get by, spend about basically 100%. So when you move money from the bottom and the middle to the top, overall spending gets constrained, and that weakens the economy. So in the current context, as you pointed out, with wages, income going up so modestly, most of the gains going to the very top. In 2010, 93% of all the gains went to the top 1%. With that kind of a recovery, not a surprise that we're not going to have robust demand, and without robust demand, we're not going to have a robust recovery.
Why is it the case? I mean, so the standard GDP calculation, right, is government plus consumption plus investment and then minus your trade deficit, right? So if it's not going to consumption and it's going into the pockets of the top 1% or whatever, why aren't we seeing that reflected in investment? In fact, we saw very good business investment numbers in the latest economic data. Where are those dollars disappearing to? Why aren't we seeing it, say, in investment?
Well, the point is, people invest when there's a return, and there's no return if there's no demand, if you can't sell your goods. If you have excess capacity, you're not going to build more excess capacity just because the Fed has low interest rates. I mean, if you look at investment overall, before the crisis, about 40% of all investment was in real estate. Now, that's going to be dampened just because we built too many houses.
Right, and we had a bust, right?
And we had a bust. The good news is that a lot of them were very shoddily built, and they'll fall apart, and we'll have to reconstruct them.
Thank heavens.
Yeah, but the fact is that we overbuilt. The other part is actually not doing badly, given how weak demand is.
Right.
It's not a lack of money. It's not the weaknesses in our financial system, and that was one of the big mistakes Obama made, that the belief was that all we need to do was to fix the financial system and everything would go back to before 2007. That was wrong.
Ed, my sense is that you don't agree with this sort of distributional point, and I want to get your thoughts on it and bring you guys in right after we take a quick break. All right, we're talking about the recovery, such as it is, and Joe, you just made this point about inequality and its role, and Ed, I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I think Joe made 3 points. The first is, I think in a recovery, you see capital recover before labor because you have high unemployment, so the wages don't rise. They're actually falling before you get back to high employment. So I don't think the pattern is so unique here. The second is, does inequality driving the slow growth? We know we had much higher inequality than Europe and Japan and much higher growth over the last few decades. We can parse through that, but it's, I think, very difficult to make the case that inequality slows growth, we have seen higher growth, higher employment, higher median wages, more hours of work per working age adult, faster productivity in the U.S. And I think that stems from a difference between Joe and I about what is causing the inequality. Is it the success of the top 1% and the innovation in the U.S. economy, or is it crony capitalism, which sub-optimizes the economy and ought to slow down growth? But the last also is Joe takes a very traditional view of investment, which is we're simply building capital to meet the demands of consumers, as opposed to what we're doing in our economy, which is pouring money into innovation, which is creating its own demand, lowering costs. You don't need demand to fund innovation. And if you really go parse through the numbers and recalculate investment to include innovation, which is largely salaries and appears as the intermediate costs of production, not as investment in and of itself, you see that we've had a very high rise in investment, and we're going to have a more volatile economy when our economy is being driven by investment. But all the indications are consistent with it: higher productivity, faster growth, more employment.
That first chart that you showed, the two lines, I think is probably one of the most defining charts of this weak recovery. We've basically had unprecedented austerity, other than the first few quarters when we had the stimulus, which many economists thought was
that's
not that
right.
big.
We've run a $1.1 trillion deficit.
Well,
spending's at 24%.
Right, but the absolute number doesn't matter.
The deficit,
recovery, that 24% is going to go down.
Or if the government has been a drag
go down.
First of all, we have to remember
we pushed stimulus for one period.
That the downturn caused the deficit, not the other way around.
Right.
The fact is, in terms of jobs, that's what we were talking about, the loss of jobs in the public sector, state, local, federal, is about 700,000. If we had normal growth, we would have added about 1.8 million jobs. So the jobs deficit in the public sector is enormous. Now, if the private sector had grown enough to offset that, I think all of us would be happy. But the point is, the private sector has not done well. You look at the last jobs report, the one that just came out, what you see is that one of the things that everybody had hoped for was a growth of exports as a source of job creation. Not there.
No way.
And everyone in the world wants to be a net exporter.
You know, one of the problems with looking only at government jobs is that government spending is up 30%. It's largely transfer payments, not employment in government, and that should flow through the economy and create employment in the private sector.
Transfer payments would go down if we were able to do more job creation. The government should have a regular role in job creation.
If we had not spent the money on unemployment insurance,
but we continue to spend it every year.
The fact is that our economy would be even weaker.
Right. I mean, I guess my question for you, Ed, my question for you, Ed, is why I understand why people are. I sort of understand why people are concerned about the deficit or we're spending too much money, but I don't see. No one I've seen makes the case of why that's the thing that's making the government the recovery sluggish. The best I've ever.
Well, Joe does. Okay. Look, there's two binding constraints.
Sorry, Ed, you want to make the case of why the sluggish recovery or the sluggish jobs recovery, particularly, what its link is to the deficit.
Yeah. Well. Sort of. Okay. I think there's two constraints that bind the economy. One is properly trained talent, incentive to take the risk which grow the economy. And that hasn't changed. The second is you need equity to bear the risk that goes along with taking those risks. And that has changed a lot. We woke up in 2009, 2010 and recognized that there's a lot more risk of damage from withdrawals from our banking system than we realized. And we have dialed down the amount of risk taking that we're willing to take per dollar of equity. Now, it's no surprise that we have more equity per dollar per employee and per dollar of GDP, and we've grown faster and we've produced more innovation than other economies have. So when we talk about spending more money in order to increase consumption in the short run, that money has to come from somewhere, and it largely comes from income that would otherwise be saved and invested as equity. Now, we look to the surplus of capital that's sitting on the sideline. That surplus is risk-averse, short-term capital that will not underwrite the risk that grows the economy. We need equity, and Joe's work is all about how equity is the binding constraint and how equity, the lack of equity, amplifies the business cycle, because when you fear that you're going to go bankrupt in a business cycle, you dial back risk-taking. If you had more equity, you wouldn't do that.
Marshall McLuhan, please.
Okay, make 2 points. First of all, investment in the kind of risk-taking kinds of things like software, R&D, is really actually quite strong. The weakness in investment, not surprise, is in things like real estate, because we overbuilt. If we hadn't had that problem, in terms of the investment sector, not consumption, not exports, not government, would be back to normal.
And you know, part of the thing is that when you look at this whole notion of conservative investment, the mortgage area is one of those where we've seen the banks behave horribly. They were given money from the United States government with the notion that they would then invest. Instead, what you've seen is in order to qualify a mortgage, you go from a 680 in 2008 to a 720 in 2012, which means that it's much more difficult for people to...
That's just the difference. Wait, let me just say, that's the different. That's just another way of saying what Ed said, right? Which is risk aversion on the part of the money that's sitting on the sidelines.
What I'm saying here is that the government gave these people this money not to hoard, but to spend. And the thought was if banks had more money, they would spend
which
it.
They have not done.
No.
There's another important constraint in the economy, which is just real resources and inflation. None of those things that you said about people wanting to invest would preclude the government from, say, building a bridge or building 100 bridges. And we got consumer construction numbers on Friday, and you can just see the amount public spending on roads, bridges, and all that stuff just continues to decline even now. And that's the unprecidented austerity that I'm...
Last very quick point. Yes.
Okay, if you go back to the Great Depression, one of the real forces that got us out of the Great Depression, particularly maintained the economy after World War II, was all the investment that was done during the Great Depression on infrastructure and all the investments that were done during the war and after the war on human capital and on technology.
And a big part of this question is how to, from whichever side you approach it, right, the cash that's sitting on the sidelines, right, the question is how to push that out. I mean, that is, in some ways, the problem behind the sluggish.
All that cash was there before 2008. You can see a chart of how that goes up. And
what you should know for the news week ahead, coming up next.